Hi, it's Monday, October 27th, and there's several things I wanted to talk about. So I'll run through them and I'll run through my agenda and then we'll get into it. The first thing I want to talk about is the interview that Maria Zakharova, who's the foreign ministry of the Russian Federation spokesperson. She's really a star. She's a gorgeous woman and obviously very cultured and speaks fluent English. Apparently, she speaks fluent Chinese as well as Russian, of course. And she met Larry Johnson and Andrew Napolitano in Moscow and had about an hour-long talk with them. Just a little bit of, I'll get into that as we go along. I want to talk about the U.S. deep state policy as it was enunciated in Daniel Ellsberg's The Doomsday Machine and also Alan Goode's book American Exception. This goes into the West's forever war against Russia and what we call continuity of agenda. And I also wanted to give some comments I have on an important interview between Dmitry Laskaris, who has a YouTube channel called Reason to Resist, and John Helmer, who is the longest-serving foreign correspondent in Russia, and he's got his own independent agency. I want to talk about the West's overarching core principle, addiction to war, and where this is all going, and of course also you could say the ultimate trump card that Russia has just come up with, which is called Burevestnik, which is a nuclear missile. So the first thing is that Maria Zakharova met Larry Johnson and Andrew Napolitano in Moscow. RT is the Russian state network. There's actually RT and Sputnik are two. I think they're Russian government-sponsored networks, and there are other networks like TASS and Izvestia and other newspapers. But RT is it's a channel that has multiple languages. Actually, I think there's a Spanish edition, there's an Arabic edition, there's an English edition, and there used to be. I don't know if there still is a French and German because the governments of those countries really don't like RT. In fact, Ursula von der Leyen, who is I guess she's the president of the European Commission or something. She's like the head honcho of the European Commission, which is a completely bogus organization. She's got a bogus job. She was never even elected to it. I don't know. It just shows the whole system of Western governance is such bullshit. It's unbelievable. But anyway, she said we've gotten rid of RT, RT's propaganda, as if she ever tells the truth. Her name is von der Leyen, and Larry Johnson likes to call her Ursula fond of lying, which is quite accurate. Anyway, so there Maria Zakharova was talking with them about Russian and U.S. relations, and the thing that really struck me was the fact that she made 2 points which I have to take issue with. One is that she sees Trump as somebody who's a real negotiator, that and Lavrov and others have said it's really great that after the Biden administration that wouldn't even talk to us, the Trump administration is actually talking with us, and that's a good thing, which I think in principle that is true. The other thing that she points out is that she says that America is a Christian country, and that America's Christianity and Russia is a Christian country should be compatible. Well, first of all, it's true that Russia was certainly has roots in the Russian Orthodox Church, but it also has Muslims, it has Jews, it has a few Buddhists. And it has a lot of holdover communists. It's like 4% of the population still votes in elections, and the Communist Party is still basically the second most influential party in Russia. And they're not, I mean, some of them. So you can be a communist and also you can be a religious person. That's not an issue. I mean, I have strong communist sympathies, socialist sympathies, but I'm also Buddhist, and that's because I see, there's a very strong social component of Buddhism, which is very compatible with socialism. They both believe in uplifting the society, uplifting the individual and uplifting the society. So, and the other issue is that when the quote unquote founding fathers of the United States wrote the Constitution, they said that there should be separation of church and state, and that people should have the right to believe whatever they want to believe and practice however they want to practice. And it said that many of them were quote unquote deists, which means that there was I guess you could say a train of thought, which is that God created the heavens and the earth, and He's still the boss essentially. But the deists said that once God created the heavens and the earth, but then He left it up to us to take care of and govern ourselves. So they had a somewhat different idea of religion in the society. But what's even more important is that I guess starting in the 19th century there was the Christianity that started to take hold in the United States. Allowed slavery, it allowed genocide, and now it's a big proponent of Zionism, which is practicing genocide. So there's some disagreement certainly within the Christian community, that within the U.S. society, that there's a certain kind of right-wing, you could say fascist element of Christianity with the United States that is not the same as Russian Orthodoxy. So I think her point, she has these two issues, and she's very solicitous towards both American Christianity and also Donald Trump. And she talks about Donald Trump as being sincere about negotiating an end to war, and Lavrov has said something similar. And yet I was just watching my friend Regis Tremblay talking with Wilmer Leon, who's a PhD political scientist, and they call Trump a complete fraud. I consider him a fraud. Larry Johnson and Andrew Napolitano are seriously disappointed with him. And the only thing that I wonder about is why is it that some of these kind of principled conservatives like Larry Johnson or Andrew Napolitano, who are, especially Andrew Napolitano, he has a very good YouTube channel. I really suggest that you listen to what he has to say, because his guests are good, and he's not ideological. So he has people like Max Blumenthal or Aaron Mate, who are more progressive. They're more leftist like myself. But we both share this idea that the military has got too much power in the United States. The Israeli lobby has too much power, and the aggressive foreign policy is not it's not helping the country. Certainly not helping the world. So I just felt that I should bring that up, and the question arises: why is she doing that? Is she doing that because she's being diplomatic and she's trying to be conciliatory or even obsequious because Trump is he's like a known egotist and known narcissist, that maybe this is part of the Russian strategy to just flatter the guy, but I don't agree with that. I think that people that the entire political class in the United States have been exploiting the rest of us for many decades, and they need to be called out on it. And I think that in China recently, from what I can tell, has taken a much stronger line towards the United States, where they're saying, "Look, we're sick of being treated like crap, and we're not going to take it anymore." And I think that Russia and Putin need to be more forceful that way. That's just my opinion. Now, I want to talk about the the U.S. deep state policy as enunciated by Daniel Ellsberg in his book called The Doomsday Machine, and also cited in Alan Goode's American Exception. So, and this is one of the reasons why I take issue with Maria Zakharova, because, she seems to think that there's some kind of sincere, sincere effort on the United States to come to some kind of accommodation with its adversaries, specifically Russia. So I'm going to read a paragraph here, which I hope will kind of set the record straight about that. This is from Aaron Goode's book, American Exception. It's quite good. He's an historian, and there's a lot of good information in here. So he says, in his memoir, The Doomsday Machine, Daniel Ellsberg offers a chilling illustration of the U.S. military's autonomy. They said that the military is under the control of the civilians, and Daniel Ellsberg is saying, not exactly. He says, while working in the Pentagon with a high security clearance, Ellsberg became aware of a document known as the Joint Strategic Capabilities Plan, otherwise known as JSCP. The President and Secretary of Defense did not know about the content or the extent of the JSCP. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had actually written up a set of practices designed to keep the Defense Secretary from inquiring about the JSCP. In fact, the JSCP was the General War Plan, and the civilians didn't know about it. Specifically, a written directive stated that the Joint Strategic Capabilities Plan, or the capital letters JSCP, should never appear in correspondence between the JCS, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and any agency of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Any JSC documents forwarded to the Secretary of Defense were to be retyped to remove any reference to the JSCP. So there's like internal censorship within the United States, so that the civilians don't even know what the military are planning. Granted, this is from Daniel Ellsberg. This goes back 30 years or more. The key element of the JSCP was that in the event of an armed conflict, that is anything beyond a small skirmish, the basic military objective of the U.S. Armed Forces is the defeat of the Sino-Soviet bloc, that is China and Russia. In other words, Ellsberg became aware of the fact that the military's plan for general war meant that if conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union broke out, U.S. strategy entailed, as a matter of course, the complete destruction of the USSR, Russia, and China with nuclear weapons. And Daniel Ellsberg was able to bring this fact out, and apparently, you could say temporarily, at least, it was brought under control. But now we have a president, President Trump, who came into office promising to bring peace, and saying he was going to solve the Ukraine war in one phone call. And where are we now? 9 or 10 months after he's in office, and he's after offering negotiations in Hungary. He's taken back his offer. He's saying it's a waste of time, and instead he's putting sanctions on Russia. So was Donald Trump sincere in his efforts to end the Ukraine war? People say, oh, it's not his fault. He can't do anything about it because the deep state. Well, there may be something to that, but we'll talk about what kind of a person Donald Trump is a little bit later on. But my concern in relation to this particular book, what it's talking about, is that we now have, Donald Trump has just renamed the Department of Defense to its true name, which is the Department of War, or the War Department. And the Secretary of Defense is Peter Hegseth, who is he's an example of these right-wing Christians who have quite violent tendencies. And in his recent talk with the admirals and generals, he said, "Your job is to kill people, and it's not your job is to defend the country. Your job is to kill people." So, is it possible that this guy Pete Hegseth is kind of looking the other way while the military is infested with many of these right-wing Christians, and you have no idea what kinds of plans they're cooking up? That is a real concern. I think people need to be thinking about that. Okay, now that kind of goes into the West's forever war against Russia and continuity of agenda, because in John Helmer talked with Dmitry Laskaris, and Helmer made the point that he said, well, when did this war against Russia start? First of all, many Americans are in a complete denial about the fact that there even is a war, between the United States and Russia. They think, Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked, and how could they have done such a terrible thing? And most people who are at least reasonably knowledgeable about this understand that the war started in 2014 with a coup staged by Joe Biden under the presidency of Obama to overthrow the democratic elected government of Ukraine and install a government which is essentially controlled by the fascist descendants of Hitler collaborators during World War II. This is a fascist government, a very brutal government, and if you've seen any of my other videos, I talk about the fact I have a friend who lives in Ukraine. She can't talk with anybody because she knows what will happen to her if she speaks out. And there's a lot, and she's a Russian speaker. The Russian language, even though most Ukrainians speak Russian as their first language, and Russian is a highly literary language. Ukraine is a language that was, kind of cobbled together between Russian and Polish and other dialects among the less educated population. But Russian is a far more elegant language than Ukrainian, and yet these lowlifes have denigrated and suppressed Russian to the extent that you go into a restaurant, they won't. The waitresses and waiters are told that they can't serve you because you're speaking Russian. So this is the kind of society that they've created. And this was they were bombing people from early on. They caused a massacre in the city of Odessa in May of 2014, and when a real hostility, war broke out between those elements in eastern Ukraine that didn't accept this coup government, and they were winning. The Germans and the French got together with Vladimir Putin and said, "Hey, we need to stop. This is terrible. They're all going to be slaughtered. Let's have a peace agreement." And then they broke the peace. They deliberately broke the peace agreement. And then they say that Russia doesn't negotiate. So John Helmer says, well, when did this war actually start? And he points out that the war did not start in 2014, and I've said this myself. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, this was Gorbachev, and Helmer says that Gorbachev was basically either bamboozled or became an outright asset of the CIA. It was really, really bad time for Russia. It was like almost as bad as if they had lost World War II. And fortunately, when I would say that some Russian nationalists managed to insert Vladimir Putin into the presidency, and he and they have been able to pull, Russia back from the brink. So, but John Helmer points out that it goes back even further than that because, and as I've pointed out, after World War II, these holdovers, these Ukrainian Nazis, were fighting the Soviet Union into the 1950s as guerrillas in Ukraine. And they were supported by the CIA. There's CIA documents that even talk about this. So it goes back that far as World War II. And before World War II, the Soviet Union was saying to France and England, Hitler is a dangerous factor here. We need to talk about collective security, which is what Russia talks about now. They say we need collective security, and the British and the French would have none of it. The Americans were off kind of in isolation, and then the only reason why the French and the British and the United States joined with the Soviet Union was because the Soviet Union, although the Soviet Union had been invaded by Germany, Germany before then had occupied France, and they were attacking England. So there's actually a movie where the ambassador to Moscow who was JFK, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ambassador, introduced a movie called Mission to Moscow, where he talked about why he went to the Soviet Union to see what was going on. He was basically acting for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He wanted to know the real truth about what the story is with the Soviet Union. Are they on our side? Can we cooperate with them? Are they worth our time? And he says, look, if Hitler had defeated the Soviet Union, they would have been able to conquer Asia, and then they would have gone after us. So that was the reason why the United States, Britain, and France cooperated against the Soviet Union. But as soon as the war was won, the British were plotting again to invade the Soviet Union, and the United States was plotting again to use nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. And after the Soviet Union fell, and Gorbachev, foolishly thought that the Cold War would be over, immediately the deep state in the United States was saying, okay, let's go after Russia again, and they almost destroyed Russia. So it goes back to as far as World War II, and it goes back further than that, because after the Soviet Union won the revolution in 1917, it was invaded by the United States, England, I think Czechoslovakia, Italy, Japan, because they saw that the Soviet Union was weak. Here's this new government. It has just managed to kick out the Tsar and the successors to the Tsar, who were you can say quote unquote liberals, but the liberals were not. They wanted to continue the war in World War I, and Lenin, said to the Russian people, "I'm offering you peace, land, and bread," and that was what won over the Russian people. You keep the message simple. They wanted peace. They didn't want to be treated as cannon fodder in World War I. They didn't want to be treated as serfs, which they were essentially. They had been serfs, and they were relieved of being serfs by one of the czars in the 19th century. But nevertheless, their economic conditions were terrible. Most of them were illiterate, and bread. They didn't want to be subject to periodic famines, and so they decided to hook up with the Soviets, and that's how the Soviet Union came into existence. But the West saw this as an extreme threat to capitalism, so they invaded with the idea that they would get rid of the Soviets and get control of Russia, break it up, and get its massive resources. It's been a resource grab that's been the U.S.'s plan for all along. But it goes back even further than that, because before World War II, you had the Crimean War, where the British tried to invade Crimea, which was part of Russia at that point, and also France and Italy and Turkey, I think, invaded Russia. And then before that you had Napoleon invading in 1812, and it wasn't just the French. He had a bunch of allies. There were the Prussians were invading, and the Poles, So it's like here's this country, Russia, sitting half in Europe and half in Asia, and it's been subject to invasions and attacks, for centuries. And you compare that to the United States, which the United States, you've got these, admittedly, a lot of really poor, down and out people came to North America to be rid of the oppressive environment in Europe, and they didn't have standing armies to fight against. They had Indians who had very little ability to resist them. So that I want to bring up this. I just was looking at the People's History of the United States because they talk about this part of it, and there was a couple of passages here which I thought were quite interesting. One was he talks about Columbus. Who's I think we all most of us know the story of Columbus. He says, to emphasize the heroism of Columbus and his successors as navigators and discoverers, and to de-emphasize their genocide, is not a technical necessity but an ideological choice. It serves unwittingly to justify what was done. My point is not that we must, in telling history, accuse, judge, condemn Columbus in absentia. It's too late for that. It would be a useless scholarly exercise in morality. But the easy acceptance of atrocities as a deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress, such as Hiroshima or Vietnam, he says, which is still with us. So in other words, the legacy of Columbus, the violence and the genocide that he initiated when he came to the Americas, has been going on ever since. One reason that these atrocities are still with us is that we have learned to bury them in a mass of other facts as radioactive wastes are buried in containers in the earth. We have learned to give them exactly the same proportion of attention that teachers and writers often give them in the most respectable of classrooms and textbooks. This learned sense of moral proportion, coming from the apparent objectivity of the scholar, is accepted more easily than when it comes from politicians at press conferences. It is therefore more deadly. So that is something that I thought would be, that is something that we need to bring out, that this is continuity of agenda. It goes back, it's not just the Rand report, which Brian Berletic talks about in 2019. This is like an existential aspect of the West's attitude, not just towards the whole world, but specifically towards Russia. Now, there's another aspect of this, which is that is this merely just a clash of civilizations, or is there a deeper problem here? And so they were talking in the People's History of the United States. He talks about the fact that a lot of poor people, were treated very poorly, and let me see if I can find this. It says, let's see, where was it? I can't find the passage right at this moment, but oh, here it is. In New Jersey in the 1740s and 1750s, poor farmers occupying land over which they and the landowners had rival claims rioted when rents were demanded of them. They go on to say that many of these people, oh, here it is. Hector St. Jean Crèvecoeur, the Frenchman who lived in America for almost 20 years, told in Letters from an American Farmer how children captured during the 7 Years' War and found by their parents, grown up and living with Indians, would refuse to leave their new families. There must be in their social bond, he said, something singularly captivating and far superior to anything to be boasted among us. For thousands of Europeans are Indians, and we have no examples of even one of those Aborigines having from choice become Europeans. In other words, Western civilization is bullshit. It's violent, it's degrading, and the indigenous peoples are far more human and kind to each other and have better social relations than us sophisticated Westerners. So there you go. This is something that I think really needs to be brought out, because the theme of my writing and speaking is the fact that we have a civilizational problem. It's a problem of consciousness. Okay, now I'm going to continue here with this conversation with Dmitry Lascaris and John Helmer. Basically, Helmer pointed all that out in his discussion with Lascaris, this centuries-long war actually against Russia. And the question is, where is all this going? And this is why I ask myself, why is Maria Zakharova speaking of Trump and the new administration as being people that we can work with? Is that really true? It's really questionable. So Helmer, towards the end of their discussion, speaks of Trump, and he says, recently Trump was talking about what's going on in Ukraine, rather in Venezuela, and he said of the people, he said, just kill them. We're going to kill people dead. So this is the President of the United States speaking in such crude terms that it's pretty, he's the perfect, the apex of what Western civilization has come to, where you actually have a President of the United States saying, kill them, just kill them dead. It's very similar to what Winston Churchill said, speaking of Indians. He said they're, a beastly group of people who they breed like rabbits, and who cares if I starve several million of them to death. This is an example of what we're talking about. But then he cites a biography of Trump and Donald Trump, in which the biography said he was as cruel to his brother as his father was cruel to them both. Cruelty by domination has been that man's psychological inheritance, and he is the President of the United States. That is what we're dealing with. And but it's not as if he is the only one, because who preceded him? Joe Biden, who facilitated the genocide in Gaza. And it was, back in Vietnam. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Madeleine Albright, Democratic Secretary of State. Do I think 500,000 Iraqi children dying because of our sanctions is worth it? Well, it's a difficult decision, but we think it's worth it. These are the kinds of people who are running our country. And what are we going to do about it? So that's what I want to talk about here. I think this is really important. So just in closing here, we've just found out that the Russians have developed a new weapon called the Berezovnik. And this is a missile that uses a nuclear-powered engine. Now, this is interesting for me personally, because I have a long memory, and I remember reading in Life magazine, which was like the preeminent magazine of the 1950s, 60s, maybe. I think it went into even the 80s. I don't know, maybe it's still around. But back then, they had all kinds of articles. It was like a big, glossy magazine, this big. And they were talking about, this is, I guess, after Sputnik, was launched by the Soviet Union. For those of you who don't know about this, in I think it was in 1957. It was either 57 or 59. The Soviet Union, the backward Soviet Union, beat the United States into space with a satellite, the first satellite that went around the Earth, and the Americans were shocked. because they thought that we're the preeminent technological power. But here are the Soviets putting this satellite into space. And I remember right after that, there were so the Americans say, okay, we can do that too. We got a missile, we're calling it the Vanguard missile, which is kind of funny. I'm going to talk about that. It was called the Vanguard missile, and there were like 4 failures of this. I remember seeing them as a kid, seeing this missile going crash, and this happened several times. They finally got a missile to work and get a satellite into orbit, but it took them several times. And back then, Kennedy was saying, we need to get the kids to do more math and science. And my cousin and I were drawing pictures of rockets and sending them. These were our designs. We're sending them to the White House, telling them how we're doing our part in the technological war with Russia. We're building missiles. We're creating designs for missiles. So the country was, kind of hopped up about this idea, but it turns out that, in the ensuing, this is since 1960 or so, we're talking, 60 years, Russia has completely outclassed the United States as far as its technology, at least its military technology is concerned, and it's proved itself to be impervious to sanctions. So you've got some really, really smart people in Russia, and they're really, they're as mad as hell, and they're not going to take it anymore. To quote Howard Beale in the Network, the movie The Network, he says, you got to get mad. I'm as mad as hell, as I'm not going to take it anymore. So this is what I want to say as far as the current state of relations between the United States and Russia. And I think Russia has pretty much had it. I think the only question that I have about Maria Zakharova and some of the other Russian elite is that they do send their kids to the West to get educated. And I think that that is a wrong thing to do, because these kids, they get, they kind of get enamored with the glamour and the glitz of the West, and they think and they have this it's almost like a Slavic inferiority complex, where they think something in the West is better than them, and it's not true. They're the Indians, that and you have a fair amount of Americans, saying we've had it with American culture. We're going to Russia because they're more humane than we Americans are. You can raise kids there. There's more respect. The streets are cleaner. They're safer. Everything. Life is better in Russia than it is in the United States. I don't live in Russia, but I've visited there. It looks pretty good. I'm not saying that there aren't some problems. There's certainly income inequality, and there's other social aspects that are not great. But overall, I would say that social relations there are certainly better off they're better than they are in the United States. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you'd like to support my channel, I really appreciate it. You can either subscribe or buy one of my information billboard T-shirts to spread the idea of awareness. I have a T-shirt which says "Be kind," or a T-shirt which says "I wish you peace and enlightenment," or "Question everything," or "Free your mind." You can buy one of those T-shirts, and when people see them, maybe they'll say, "Oh, that's an interesting T-shirt," and then you can engage them, and that's the way my form of social subversion is to get people to talk with each other and start to say, "Hey, we've got some issues here. We need some consciousness raising here." So that's what I want to do. And again, thanks again for listening to my rant here, and I will talk with you again soon. Thanks for listening, and take care.